She chose the rancher over her tribe. What she did next, no one expected. 3 years. That's how long the woman had been kept in chains by her own people, not by enemies, not by settlers, by the very tribe that raised her. The desert wind carried dust across the open ground where two worlds were about to collide. And at the center of it all stood a prisoner whose crime was nothing more than saying no, but what they were about to discover would shatter everything they thought they knew about loyalty, freedom, and the price both demand, because sometimes the most dangerous choice isn't running away, it's choosing to go back. The sun hammered down on the ceremonial ground where tribal leaders gathered in a half circle, their faces carved from stone. In silence, Ione knelt in the center, wrists bound behind her back, ankles shackled with iron that had worn grooves into her skin over 3 long years. She didn't look at any of them, didn't need to. She'd memorized every face that had voted to chain her, every voice that had called her defiant, every pair of eyes that had looked away when she screamed the first month. Her hair fell forward, curtaining a face that had forgotten softness, 25 years old, and she'd spent the last 3 as a warning to other women who might think about refusing what the elders decided for them. Cyrus Monroe stood at the center of the gathering, his ceremonial headdress catching the light as he surveyed the assembled crowd. He was the kind of leader who believed his word was law because it had always been law, and questioning it was the same as tearing down everything their ancestors built. His voice carried across the open ground with the weight of absolute authority beyond the tribal gathering. A lone rider approached. The horse moved steady, unhurried, like its rider had all the time in the world and knew it. Harlan Briggs sat tall in the saddle, his weathered face betraying nothing as he took in the scene before him. He'd come for a land negotiation, nothing more. The tribal council wanted to discuss water rights, grazing boundaries, the usual friction that came from two communities sharing space. Neither wanted to give up. He hadn't expected to see a woman in chains. Ione's eyes tracked the rider as he dismounted. Something in her chest tightened. Not hope she'd learned better than that, but recognition. This was someone from outside, someone who didn't know her story, didn't carry 3 years of judgment in his gaze. For a brief second, their eyes met across the distance, and she saw something flicker there, surprise, maybe disgust. Then his face went neutral again, and he turned his attention to Cyrus, the tribal leader. Stepped forward, one hand raised in greeting, the other resting on a walking staff that was more symbol than necessity. His voice carried the practiced rhythm of someone used to being obeyed. "You came alone." Harlan's response was measured, his attention still partially on the woman kneeling in the dust. Was told this was about water access. Didn't figure I needed an army for conversation. Cyrus's expression shifted, something calculating moving behind his eyes. He gestured broadly to the gathered crowd, then specifically toward Ione, as if she were part of the inventory being discussed. "We have matters beyond water to settle. Your people want access to the northern river. We want resolution to old debts." Ione's jaw tightened. She knew what was coming, had known since they dragged her from the isolated shelter where they kept her and forced her to kneel here in front of everyone. She wasn't part of a negotiation. She was the negotiation. Harlan's gaze moved from Cyrus to Ione, then back again. His voice stayed level, but something had shifted in his posture. "I came here to talk about land, not people." "She is not people," Cyrus said, and the words landed like stones. "She is property of this tribe, a debt we are willing to settle. You take her, we grant access to the river. Everyone benefits." The silence that followed was suffocating. Ion's breathing had gone shallow, her bound hands trembling behind her back. 3 years of imprisonment, and now she was being traded like livestock. Part of her wanted to scream. The other part, the part that had learned to survive by going silent, knew it wouldn't matter. But Harlan hadn't moved, hadn't agreed, hadn't ridden away. He stood there, studying the woman in chains. And for the first time in 3 years, I only felt something crack open inside her chest. Not hope, still not that, but the faintest possibility that someone might see her as more than a war anymore. Then property, more than a lesson in what happened when you refused to obey. What did she do? Harlan asked quietly. Cyrus's expression darkened. She defied sacred law, refused a union that would have brought strength to our people. Her punishment is just— Harlan's eyes stayed on Ione. She held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to appear weak, even though every part of her was screaming. In that moment, something passed between them, and understanding that neither had words for yet, he saw someone trapped. She saw someone who might actually care. I'll need time to think about this, Harlan finally said. There is no time, Cyrus replied sharply. You accept the terms or you leave with nothing. And that when I only realized something that made her blood run cold. This wasn't about water rights. This was about getting rid of her. They'd finally found a way to make her someone else's problem, to erase the reminder of her. Defiance without outright ending her life. She'd be gone, forgotten, and the tribal laws would remain unchallenged. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have predicted, was that the man standing in front of them wasn't the kind who made decisions under pressure. And the woman kneeling in chains wasn't done fighting yet. Harlan didn't speak for a long moment, just stood there, hat pulled low against the sun, studying the woman who refused to lower her gaze. Most people looked away when faced with power. She didn't. That told him more than any explanation Cyrus could offer. I'll take her, he said finally. The words fell like a hammer. Ione's breath caught not relief, not yet, but something close to it, a crack in the wall she'd built around herself over 3 years of captivity. Cyrus's expression shifted to satisfaction. He gestured to 2 younger men who moved forward, producing a worn leather pouch that they handed to Harlan. Inside, a crude map, showing the northern river access and grazing boundaries. The transaction was complete before Ione fully understood what was happening. She was property being transferred, a problem being solved, but when Harlan approached her, something in his movements made her reassess. He didn't grab, didn't yank her to her feet like she was livestock. He knelt down in the dust beside her, eye level, and his voice came out quiet enough that only she could hear. Can you walk? The question was so unexpected that I only almost forgot to answer. 3 years and no one had asked her anything. They'd ordered, commanded, dictated. Never asked. Yes, she managed, her voice rough from disuse. Harlan's hands moved to the shackles at her ankles. The metal had worn grooves into her skin, old scars layered over older ones. His jaw tightened when he saw the damage, something dark flickering across his face. He worked the iron cuffs open with careful precision, and the moment they fell away, I only felt the absence like a physical shock. 3 years, 3 years of that weight. Her legs trembled when she tried to stand, and Harlan's hand steadied her elbow. Brief contact. Nothing more, but it was the first touch in years that wasn't meant to restrain or punish. She pulled away instinctively, and he let her, understanding written in the way he stepped back to give her space behind them. Cyrus watched with the cold assessment of someone who just rid himself of a problem. She's yours now. What happens to her is no longer our concern. Harlan turned, and his voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before. She's not mine. Nobody owns people. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Cyrus's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. The negotiation was done, the terms accepted. Arguing now would only reveal weakness. Ian stood on unsteady legs, wrists still bound behind her back, watching this stranger who just paid for her freedom or what? Passed for it. She didn't trust him, couldn't afford to, but the way he'd spoken just now, the way he'd removed the ankle shackles with careful hands instead of rough indifference, made something shift inside her chest. Harlan moved to his horse, retrieving a canteen. He held it out to her, then seemed to remember her hands were still tied. Without a word, he circled behind her, and she felt the pressure on her wrists release as he cut through the leather bindings. The rush of blood back in her hands made her gasp. Pins and needles shooting up her arms. Drink, he said, offering the canteen again. Ione took it with shaking hands, the water hitting her throat like a blessing. She'd been given water, of course enough to survive, but this felt different. This was being offered, not rationed. When she finished, she handed it back, and their fingers brushed for just a second. His hands were calloused. Rough from work, but steady. "We're leaving," Harlan said quietly, his eyes scanning the assembled tribal members who watched with varying degrees of curiosity and disdain. "Can you ride?" I only nodded, though she wasn't sure. 3 years without riding would have weakened anyone, but she'd rather die trying than show weakness here in front of people who'd spent years breaking her down. Harlan mounted his horse, then extended his hand down to her. She stared at it for a heartbeat. This offer of help from a complete stranger, this man who just traded water rights for a woman in chains. Then she gripped his forearm, and he pulled her up behind him. In one smooth motion, the moment her legs settled on either side of the horse, the moment she felt the animals' warmth beneath her, and the open space ahead instead of walls and chains, something in Ione's chest cracked wide. Open, not freedom yet, but the possibility of it, as they rode away from the tribal gathering. She didn't look back, didn't give them the satisfaction, but she felt every Ion. Her back felt Cyrus's cold assessment following them across the dust. What she didn't know yet was that those eyes would come for her again, that her people would demand her return, and that the choice she'd have to make would be far more complicated than simply riding away into a new life, because freedom, she was about to learn, always came with a price. The ride to Harlan's ranch took 2 hours through open country that seemed to stretch forever. Ione sat behind him in silence, her hands gripping the back of the saddle instead of his waist, keeping distance. Even in proximity, the wind pulled at her hair, and with each mile, the weight of 3 years in chains felt both lighter and impossibly heavier at the same time. When the ranch came into view, it wasn't much: a weathered cabin, a small stable, a corral with 3 horses grazing in late afternoon sun, simple, isolated, exactly the kind of place someone would choose if they wanted to be left alone. Harlan dismounted first, then offered his hand again. This time, Ione took it without hesitation, her legs nearly buckling when her feet hit solid ground. Muscles that hadn't been used properly in years protested violently, and she grabbed the horse's flank to steady herself. "Take your time," Harlan said, not moving to help unless she asked. Respecting the space she clearly needed, Ione straightened slowly, forcing her legs to remember how to bear weight. She studied the ranch with careful eyes, looking for exits, for weapons, for anything that might become important if this turned out to be another kind of prison. Old habits from captivity died hard. "You're free to leave whenever you want," Harlan said, reading her assessment. "I'm not keeping you here." The words should have brought relief. Instead, they brought confusion. 3 years of being told exactly what to do, where to stand, when to speak, and now this stranger was offering freedom like it was simple, like she could just walk away into the desert and survive. Where would I go? The question came out harsher than she intended. Harlan considered this, then gestured toward the cabin. "Inside, there's food, water, a bed. Take what you need. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what comes next." I only followed him inside, every nerve on high alert. The cabin was sparse: own room with a sleeping area, a table of stone, fireplace, no decorations, no softness. It looked like a place where someone existed rather than lived. Harlan moved to the fireplace, building kindling with practiced efficiency. "There's a room in the back. It's small, but it's yours if you want it. Door has a lock on the inside." That detail, the lock on the inside, made something in Ion's throat tighten. He understood. Somehow this rancher she'd known for 3 hours understood that the worst part wasn't being locked in. It was not having control over whether you could lock others out. She nodded, not trusting her voice, as Harlan worked the fire too. Life. I only moved to the small window, looking out across the open land toward the direction they'd come from. Somewhere out there, her people were gathering, talking, deciding what to do about the woman who'd been taken from them. More accurately, the woman they'd sold away. "They won't let this stand," she said quietly. Harlan glanced up from the fire. What do you mean? I only turned to face him. And for the first time, she let him see the fear she'd been hiding under defiance. Cyrus wanted me gone. That's why he made the deal, but there are others in the tribe who won't accept it. They'll see it as theft, as you taking something that belongs to them. You don't belong to anyone. That's not how they see it. Ione's hands clenched at her sides. And I'm not the only one. There are 6 other women being held the same way. I was some for longer if word spreads that I'm free, that I was traded away, and not punished for it. Those women will start asking why they can't be free, too. Harlan straightened, understanding dawning in his eyes. So, they'll come for you. They'll come for what I represent, proof that their system can be broken, that someone outside their control can decide that their laws don't matter. Ion moved away from the window, her voice dropping. They'll demand you return me, and if you refuse, she didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. The implication hung heavy in the air between them, that his act of compassion had just put him in the middle of something far more dangerous than a land negotiation. Harlan was quiet for a long moment, firelight casting shadows across his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. Let them come. You're not going back. It was the first time anyone had said those words to her, not as an owner claiming property, but as someone who decided that another person's freedom mattered more than his own safety. Ione stared at him, this stranger who'd upended her entire world in the span of hours and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 3 years. Hope. But hope was dangerous because out in the desert, riders were already mounting their horses, and Cyrus Monroe was making a decision that would test whether one man's conviction could stand against an entire tribe's demand for justice. They came at dawn. I only heard them before she saw them. The thunder of hooves across hard ground, the kind of sound that meant numbers, meant force, meant intention. She'd been awake for hours anyway, standing by the window in the small back room Harlan had given her, watching the horizon like it might offer answers. Now it offered warriors. She moved quickly through the cabin to where Heron was already at the door, rifle in hand, but not raised, not yet. His face was set in hard lines as he counted the riders approaching. 12, maybe 15, more than enough to overwhelm one man if they wanted to stay inside, he said without looking at her. I only ignored him, moving to stand just behind his shoulder. If they were coming for her, she wouldn't hide like a frightened animal. 3 years in chains had taken many things from her, but it hadn't taken her spine. The riders formed a loose semicircle around the front of the cabin, horses stamping and snorting in the morning chill. Cyrus sat at the center, flanked by 2 younger men. I only recognized enforcers who carried out the council's decisions without question. Their faces were stone, their weapons visible but not drawn. Harlan Briggs, Cyrus's voice carried across the distance with practiced authority. We have come to reclaim what belongs to us. Harlan's grip tightened on the rifle, but his voice stayed level. We had an agreement. I held up my end. The agreement is void. Cyrus gestured to one of the men beside him, who produced a rolled document. The council has determined that the woman was not the tribe's to trade. She remains under tribal law and must be returned for proper judgment. Ione's jaw clenched. Of course, they'd found a way to undo their own deal, to take back the water rights and reclaim her at the same time. Cyrus had probably planned this from the beginning. Get rid of her temporarily, then use her return as an excuse to demonstrate tribal power. She's not property, Harlan said, his voice harder. Now, and your laws don't reach onto my land. One of the younger warriors urged his horse forward, his hand moving to the weapon at his belt. You don't dictate what our laws reach. Give her back or we take her. The tension crackled like lightning about to strike. Ion could feel Harlan's body coiled beside her, ready to fight if necessary. And he would fight. She realized this stranger who'd known her less than a day would actually stand against 15 armed men because he decided her freedom mattered. The thought was both terrifying and intoxicating. There's another option, I only said quietly, her voice cutting through the standoff. Harlan glanced at her sharply. No. But she'd already stepped forward, moving past him to stand in the doorway where all the riders could see her. The morning sun hit her face, illuminating the scars on her wrists, the hollow shadows under her eyes that 3 years of captivity had carved. She looked like what she was, a woman who'd survived something brutal. "I'll return," she said clearly. The words landed like stones in still water. Cyrus's expression shifted to satisfaction. Harlan's hand shot out, gripping her arm, not roughly but firmly. "You don't have to do this." I only met his eyes, and in that moment something passed between them that had nothing to do with words, understanding, trust, something deeper that neither of them had names for yet. "Yes, I do," she said quietly, only for him to hear, "but not the way they think." She turned back to the mounted warriors, her voice rising. "I'll return to face judgment, public judgment in front of the entire tribe, not hidden away, not in chains. I want every person to see what happens when someone challenges your laws." Cyrus's satisfaction faltered slightly. This wasn't what he'd expected. He'd wanted her dragged back in shame, locked away again, her brief taste of freedom, serving as a warning to others. But a public trial was different. A public trial meant witnesses, meant questions she could ask, meant a platform she could use. "The council will decide the terms of your judgment," Cyrus said carefully. "No," Ione countered, "those are my terms. Public trial, or I disappear into this territory where you have no authority and you never see me again. Your choice." The standoff shifted. Now it was Cyrus who had to decide: take her back under her conditions, or risk losing her entirely and admitting their laws couldn't reach beyond tribal land. Behind her, I only felt Harlan's presence like a wall of support. He hadn't agreed to this, hadn't wanted this, but he understood something crucial, that she wasn't running anymore. She was choosing her battlefield. Cyrus's eyes narrowed, calculating the angles, the risks. Finally, he nodded. "Once 3 days, the tribe will gather. You will stand trial." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to something almost like a warning. "But know this, if you challenge our laws in front of everyone, the price of failure will be far worse than chains." I only lifted her chin. "I'm counting on it." The warriors turned their horses, dust rising as they rode back toward tribal land. And in the silence they left behind, Harlan turned to Ione with something between admiration and fury in his eyes. "What did you just do?" Harlan stared at her, like she'd lost her mind. Maybe she had. Maybe 3 years in chains had broken something in her that couldn't be fixed. But Ione had never felt more clear-headed in her life. "You just volunteered to go back," Harlan said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "to the people who kept you prisoner for 3 years, to face a trial that's designed to break you. No, I only moved back inside the cabin." Her movements sharp with purpose. "I volunteered to force them to answer for what they've done, in front of everyone where they can't hide behind closed councils and private punishments." Harlan followed her inside, shutting the door harder than necessary. "They'll never let you speak. They'll silence you the moment you try." Maybe I only turn to face him, or maybe I'll say enough before they can stop me that other people start asking questions about why 6 women are locked away, questions about what laws allow that, questions about whether those laws serve the tribe or just the men who made them. The words hung between them, and Harlan's expression shifted from anger to something closer to understanding. He moved to the table, bracing his hands against the worn wood. "This is what you meant," he said quietly, "about the other women. You're not just fighting for yourself. I can't run away and leave them there. I spent 3 years listening to them cry at night, 3 years watching them lose pieces of themselves day by day. If there's a chance, any chance, that my trial could change things, I have to take it." Harlan's jaw worked. "And if it doesn't work, if they just lock you up again, only worse this time." I only met his eyes steadily. "Then at least I tried. At least I didn't choose my freedom over theirs." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to voice. Finally, Harlan straightened, his Decision made. Then I'm coming with you, no. Not negotiable, his voice was firm. You demanded a public trial. That means witnesses from outside the tribe. I'm coming as your witness, as proof that someone outside their system cares whether justice is actually served. I only started to protest, then stopped because he was right, having an outsider present changed the calculation, made it harder for Cyrus to manipulate the proceedings without it looking like exactly what it was, a show trial designed to maintain control. Why are you doing this? She asked quietly. You don't know me. You've risked enough already. Harlan moved closer, close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his hair at the temples, close enough that the space between them felt charged with something neither of them had words for yet. I had a wife once, he said, his voice low. She died because I didn't stand up when it mattered, didn't challenge something I knew was wrong because it was easier to look away. His eyes held hers. I'm not making that mistake again. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest. I only felt something shift in her chest, not just gratitude, but recognition. They were both people who'd been shaped by failure, by the weight of choices they couldn't take back. She lifted her hand slowly, giving him time to move away if he wanted. When he didn't, she placed it against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her palm. Thank you, she whispered. Harlan's hand covered hers, warm and calloused. The touch lasted only a moment before they both stepped back. The intensity of the connection too much to sustain without acknowledgement. Neither of them was ready to make. We should leave at first light, Harlan said, his voice rougher than usual. Give ourselves time to prepare before the trial. I only nodded. 3 days, 3 days to plan how to dismantle a system that had crushed her. 3 days to figure out how to turn a trial meant to silence her into a weapon for change. As evening fell, they worked in companionable silence. Harlan checking supplies, Ione mentally rehearsing every word she would say, every question she would force them to answer. The small cabin felt both too large and too small at the same time, the awareness between them constant and undeniable. When darkness finally came, I only stood at the window of her small room, looking out toward the tribal lands. Somewhere out there, 6 women sat in chains, wondering if anyone remembered they existed, wondering if anyone cared enough to fight for them. Tomorrow they would have their answer, and Cyrus Monroe would learn that the woman he'd tried to erase had become something far more dangerous than a prisoner. She'd become someone with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The journey back to tribal land took half a day. Ione rode beside Harlan in silence, her mind rehearsing every word she would say, every truth she would force them to hear. The closer they got, the more her body remembered what felt like to be trapped, but she pushed the fear down deep where it couldn't reach her voice. When they crested the final ridge, the sight below stopped them both. The entire tribe had gathered. Hundreds of people formed a massive circle in the open desert, their horses creating a wall of flesh and dust that blocked any escape. At the center stood Cyrus, flanked by the council elders, waiting with the patience of men who believed the outcome was already decided. Harlan's hand moved instinctively to the rifle at his saddle. That's more than I expected. He wants witnesses, Ione said quietly, wants everyone to see what happens when someone defies him. He thinks this will be his victory. They rode down slowly, and the circle parted just enough to let them through before closing behind them like a trap. Ione felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, some curious, some hostile, some carefully blank. She searched the crowd for familiar faces and found them. Women she'd known before her imprisonment, men who'd voted to chain her. And there, near the back, a small group of younger women whose expressions held something I only recognized instantly. Hope. Cyrus stepped forward, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. Ione has returned to face judgment for her crimes against our laws. She refused a sacred union. She dishonored her family. She rejected the wisdom of our elders. He paused, letting the words sink in. The Penalty has always been clear. Then let's be clear about everything, I only said, her voice steady as she dismounted. Heron followed, standing just behind her right shoulder, close enough to support, far enough to let her fight her own battle. Cyrus's eyes narrowed. You will speak only when I will speak now. I only stepped forward into the center of the circle. You want everyone here to witness my judgment? Then they'll witness the truth, all of it. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Cyrus raised his hand for silence. But I only was already speaking, her voice rising to carry to every year. I was imprisoned for 3 years, not for stealing, not for violence, for saying no to a man I didn't choose, for believing I had the right to decide my own path. She turned slowly, making eye contact with as many people as possible. And I'm not the only one. Right now, 6 women are being held in chains, some for refusing marriage, some for speaking against council decisions, some for crimes as simple as teaching their daughters to read. The murmur grew louder. Several people shifted uncomfortably. Cyrus's jaw tightened, but he let her continue, stopping her now would only prove her point. Nessa has been held for 4 years, Ione said, naming names, making them real. She tried to take her own life twice because the pain of living in chains became unbearable. Ka has been there for 5 years. She's lost her mind, doesn't even know her own name anymore. These are your daughters, your sisters, your neighbors, and you let it happen because you were told it was justice. A woman in the crowd broke, her hand flying to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. I only recognized her, Nessa's mother, the woman who'd stopped visiting after the first year, who'd chosen the comfort of forgetting over the pain of remembering. Our laws say this is right, Cyrus interjected, trying to regain control. Our traditions, your traditions, are killing us. Ion cut him off, and you know it. You've always known it because your own wife was held under the same laws before she died. The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye turned to Cyrus, whose face had gone pale. I only pressed forward, her voice softer now, but no less devastating. She was imprisoned for speaking against the council 15 years ago. You were younger then. You didn't have the power to free her. And when she died in those chains, you swore you'd never let it happen again. But you did. You became the very thing that destroyed her. Cyrus stood frozen, the truth laid bare before everyone. And in that moment, Harlan stepped forward, his voice clear and firm. I'm an outsider. I have no stake in your laws, but I've seen what those laws do. I've seen the scars they leave. And if you let this continue, you're not preserving your tribe. You're destroying it from within. The crowd erupted into arguments, voices rising from every direction, some defending tradition, others demanding change. And at the center of it all stood Ione, waiting to see whether truth was enough to break chains that had held for generations. The chaos of voices gradually subsided as Cyrus raised his hand. But this time, the gesture carried no authority, just the desperate attempt of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse. My wife's death has nothing to do with this trial, he said, his voice strained. It has everything to do with it. An older woman stepped forward from the crowd, someone I only recognized as one of the tribal healers. Her voice shook but held steady. I was there when she died. I held her hand, and her last words were begging you to make sure no other woman suffered the way she did. Cyrus's composure cracked for the first time in the proceedings. He looked like what he was, an old man carrying decades of guilt and regret. I tried to protect the tribe by doing the same thing that killed her. Another voice, younger this time, a woman in her 30s, pushed through the crowd. I'm Kaya's sister. I haven't seen her in 5 years. Because you said it would dishonor our family to visit, but Ione is right. We've all been complicit in this. We've all chosen comfort over courage. One by one, women began to stand. Not all of them, not even most, but enough that the message was clear. Silence was ending. A young mother holding a child stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper, but audible in the sudden quiet. If my daughter grows up and refuses a marriage someday, will you chain her too? Will you tell me it's For her own good, while she wastes away in darkness? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Cyrus looked around at the faces surrounding him, people he'd led for decades, people who were now seeing him differently. His shoulders sagged. "I never wanted to become this," he said quietly, the admission costing him everything, "but I didn't know how to change it, without admitting I'd been wrong, without admitting that my wife's death was for nothing. It doesn't have to be for nothing." I only said, her voice gentle. "Now, you can honor her by ending what killed her, by being brave enough to admit the laws need to change." The silence stretched. Then one of the elder councilmen stepped forward, someone I only had never expected to be an ally. "The laws were made by men long dead," he said slowly. "We are not bound to carry their mistakes into eternity. I vote to release all women held under marriage refusal charges. I vote to reform the laws that allow imprisonment without trial." Another elder joined him. Then another. Not all of them. 3 remained silent, faces hard with disapproval. But 5 votes was enough. The majority had shifted. Cyrus looked at Ione, and in his eyes she saw something she'd never thought possible: gratitude. Not for exposing him, but for giving him a path to redemption. "The women will be released," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd with the weight of finality. "The laws will be rewritten, and Ione will be recognized as free." With no conditions, the crowd erupted, some in celebration, some in anger, most in stunned disbelief that change had actually come. Harlan moved to Ione's side, his presence steady as the world shifted around them. But Ione wasn't finished. She stepped closer to Cyrus, her voice low enough that only he and those nearest could hear. "The women will need help. They've been broken. Some of them won't know how to be free anymore. And the families who abandoned them will need to face what they did." Cyrus nodded slowly. "I know, and I'll make sure they have what they need." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "Your courage today saved lives, including mine. I've been dead inside since my wife passed. Perhaps now I can finally honor her memory properly. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't friendship, but it was acknowledgement. And sometimes that was enough." As the crowd began to disperse, some angry, some hopeful, I only felt Harlan's hand rest lightly on her lower back, a touch so brief it might have been imagined, except for the warmth it left behind. "You did it," he said quietly. I only looked around at the faces, women who would sleep unchained tonight for the first time in years, mothers who wouldn't have to fear for their daughters, men who were being forced to confront truths they'd ignored. "We did it," she corrected, and for the first time in 3 years, I only felt something she'd thought was lost forever. Freedom, real freedom, the kind that came not from running away, but from standing your ground until the world had no choice but to change around you. 6 months had changed everything. I only stood at the edge of the newly built bridge, not a physical structure of wood and rope, but a path worn smooth by constant travel between Harlan's ranch and tribal land. She'd made this journey so many times now that her horse knew the way without guidance, hooves finding purchase on familiar ground. Behind her, the sun climbed higher, warming the desert air. Ahead, she could see the tribal settlement where 6 women now walked freely, their wrists bare of chains, their voices no longer silenced. The recovery had been slow, painful. Nessa still woke screaming some nights. Ka was relearning her own name syllable by syllable with patience that broke and mended hearts in equal measure, but they were healing, and more importantly, they were free. Ione had chosen to live between worlds, 3 days each week at the ranch with Heron, where she'd learned that intimacy could be gentle. That touch didn't have to restrain. That saying yes meant something only when you'd always had the right to say no. 4 days with the tribe, teaching young women about choices, about rights, about the difference between tradition worth keeping and tradition worth breaking. The romance between her and Heron had unfolded slowly, built on a foundation of respect that made every moment feel earned. Their first kiss had happened 2 months after the trial under stars that witnessed a tenderness neither had expected to find. Their first night Together came later, still when she was ready, when the ghosts of chains no longer haunted her skin. Now when she rode back to the ranch at week's end, he waited for her, not with ownership, with partnership, with the quiet certainty of someone who understood that her freedom included the freedom to choose him again. And again, today was different, though today marked 6 months since the laws changed and the tribe was gathering to formalize new agreements, agreements Ione had helped write, agreements that gave women voice in council decisions, that prohibited imprisonment without trial, that recognized forced marriage as a crime rather than a right. As she approached the settlement, she saw Cyrus waiting near the council grounds. He'd aged in these months, but the weight he carried seemed lighter now. He spent his days helping the women he'd once helped imprison, offering whatever small redemptions a man could find by undoing his past. "They're ready for you," he said as she dismounted. Ione nodded, then paused. "How is Nessa today?" "Better. She smiled yesterday first time in years," her mother said. Cyrus's voice carried something that might have been hope. "You were right about all of it, about what we become. We're becoming something different now. That's what matters." She walked toward the gathering where young women waited, girls who would never know chains, who would grow up believing their voices mattered because I only had proven it possible. Among them sat Harlan, the only outsider invited to witness the new council's first session, his presence a reminder that change had come from unexpected places. Their eyes met across the distance, and the look they shared needed no words. She'd chosen him. But more than that, she'd chosen herself, had chosen to be someone who transformed pain into purpose, who turned imprisonment into a platform for freedom. The young women gathered closer as Ione took her seat behind them. The 6 freed women watched, living proof that courage could break what cruelty had built. And somewhere in the distance, the ranch waited, a home she'd returned to by choice, to a man who understood that loving her meant letting her be exactly who she'd fought to become. This was what no one had expected. Not escape, but revolution. Not running away, but running toward a future where freedom wasn't given by men in power, but claimed by women brave enough to demand it. And in the end, that made all the difference. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you powerful stories like these. Your support means